All right. Our intent here with the F100 case study review is to start the process and run through everything we've talked about throughout all the F100 blocks, starting at the combatant commander, deciding what he needs, all the way down through a unit, through the sustainable readiness model. And we're going to carry forth the same fuel unit example that we carried through in class, but we're going to add a lot more depth to this. It's only 4 slides. But we're going to try to show everything and how it's not linear all the time. So let's go ahead and get started now. We've talked about these documents before. The National Security Strategy feeds into the NDS, into the National Military Strategy. And those are all looked at by the combatant commander who develops their operational plans based on any requirements that are out there that needs to be done. So in our scenario, the job mission analysis takes place. Then you're familiar with you'll do an exercise later in the joint operational planning process. So for our purposes, 8th Army does this. USFK looks at their mission, does a mission analysis of their O plan, and looks at they've got to get fuel from point A to point B, and this is all for training purposes only here, so don't need to get any classification issues. And they identify a capability gap that they aren't able to deliver 150,000 gallons of fuel from point A to point B in sets by C+15 over this rugged mountain terrain in order to supply forces, and of course with the comm plan. So the USFK commander then creates an IPL, an integrated priority list, and they submit that back to the joint staff. And this is the case study we're going to carry out because the services are responsible for providing the capabilities needed by the combatant commanders in order to support their missions. In this case, I'll plan 123-45X. So for our case study, some of the different documents at the National Strategic Guidance, you've seen some of these and talked about them in class. Those are all looked at as we discussed through our Title 10 lens as the Army and the service provider. What do we need to give back to the combatant commanders? What type of units and capabilities do we need to have? Well, to do that, we create the Army plan. And these are the 5 documents of the Army plan that gives us that vision, the long-term vision, the short to near-term plan, our planning guidance every year, our programming guidance for funds, and then the Army campaign plan, which is the op order every year. Then that turns into the Army concept framework. Of those, you have the Army capstone concept. We briefly touched on that in class. We really discussed the Army operating concept, the overarching concept of how the Army is going to function over the next 20 years. And we've talked about that as the current one is winning in a complex world. And from that come the functional concepts, all the battlefield operating systems, and any special concepts that need to come out. So now we're going to follow this timeline here. We'll break it out. So going back to our example, the combatant commander creates his IPL, submits it to the joint staff, and that really starts the JSID's process. So they submit it to the J8 on the joint staff, who's the gatekeeper. They do all their processing. There's a lot of other things that go back on behind the scenes on this. Several different boards, and they approve the requirement or disapprove the requirement. But if they approve it, then they're going to assign it to a lead service. They'll decide which of the services is going to be the lead agent to solve this problem. So in our case, it's been assigned to the Army because this is a ground fuel problem. So TRADOC will get it. They'll do a little bit of assessment. They'll assign it to a center of excellence, depending on the type of requirement it is. In our case, it's going to go to the Sustainment Center of Excellence, who will conduct their CBA, the Capabilities-Based Assessment. That's phase 1 of our force development process. So they're going to develop a URS and the .mil-PF solutions, a URS if there's an organizational change or any other .mil-PFP solutions. And that's going to end the force development process phase 1. Once they're done, they'll submit it back to TRADOC, and TRADOC will approve the URS if there is one, and any ICD documents, the initial capabilities documents. Well, that's going to end phase 2 of the force design process. Now, if it's an organizational function, this is an organizational solution, either a new one or a change. That goes to force structure. That's what we talked about in F103. If there's a materiel solution, that'd be the DAS, the acquisition system, that goes to F104. And then there's the other solutions that we're not really going to hit on here. There's doctrine, there's facilities, there's training solutions, leadership and education, policy, facilities, and personnel. I'll briefly touch on the personnel piece later on as we get into the force integration. But understand that the rest of those other domains of .mil PFP are being handled by other organizations. But for our purposes, we're really going to focus on the organization and material pieces here. So now, as all of the structure is going on, the material is going on this way, PPB is going on in concert. Now, it's our F103 Bravo class. Planning is all of this, starting at the next, when the president does his national security strategy, all the way down to the commander creating the IPL. All of that is the planning process. And planning is done by a lot of people, but once it gets to the Army, the headquarters DA G357 is in charge of the whole planning process. All of this Army function, from the Title 10 lens all the way down to the functional concept. They're setting the stage, writing the big documents, approving those that are written by TRADOC. And that can last years. There's no timeline. Planning can happen, like I said, with the Army operating concept is looking at the Army of 2040. So you're talking a long way out. Plus, they also have to shorten it down for the next couple of years just for budget reasons. What are the priorities for programming? Programming piece is going to determine the dollar requirements for the out years, for the next 5 years, as we talked about in our PPBE class. That's all led by the DAG8. A lot of organizations do this. Every organization in the Army is doing parts of programming, so I'm submitting up the requirements for the next 5 years. But DAG8 is the policy and senior cat herder for that. And that usually takes about 20 months. Now, it starts every year, so there are several of them obviously going concurrently. But that's for the next 5 years. After that is the budgeting phase. That's run by the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Financial Management and Comptroller. And that's an 8-month process from once we get everything submitted up to the over to Congress, and then they start that whole process of approving a budget. And then we get the money, we start executing it, and again, that's the ASAFM&C's role as Overwatch to make sure that everything's being funded and spent properly, and the units down at starting at the majors, controlling battalion and organizational budgets, making sure that things are being spent properly. And that's obviously a 1 year for our purposes for operations and maintenance. Some acquisition dollars are longer, facilities dollars are longer, but for our purposes, most of the funding we're going to have is 1 year money. So this is the same chart. All I've done is just kind of moved a couple of things off the top here, but we left off with TRADOC has approved the unit reference sheet. So they've got the FDU process going. So let's look at organizational change. If we're going to change an organization, either a new one or modify one we have. Well, the FDU process, the TOE and the BOIP are approved. And that's all done, and the lead agent for that for the G3 is USAFMSA. And you can look at all those documents on FMS Web. And that once that TOE and the BOIP are approved, that ends the FDP Phase 3, the Force Design Process Phase 3. So now we have an approved TOE, knowing how many people and how much equipment we're going to need for the future. Then we do TAA, and again, that's done by USAFMSA. That's done by the Center of Army Analysis for Phase 1. We'll do the TDA. They'll kick out the Phase 1, the quantitative data, and then all the quality data is done in Phase 2 by the COPCOMs, the staff, and all the organizations to come up with what the Army is going to look like. And that determines the spaces of people, where the authorizations are. Now, DOD and the Joint Chairman, or the Chairman of Joint Chiefs, they submit the directed force to QDR and other things at the beginning of the TAA process to help. That's the commander's guidance. You do the whole mission analysis, come up with what it's going to look like. Of course, the Army puts the Army plan and other things in the front as well. They do the whole TAA process, and at the end, the primary document for the Army is the R-Struct. And that's going to tell us, the Army, what the Army is going to look like for the next 2 to 5 years. Now, you see this little red star here. Every time you see a red star, that is one of the different phases of the Army life cycle model that we looked at in phase 1. So this would go to the deployment. Where is it going to be? That phase. The distribution. Where is it going to be? Which installations is it going to be on? So that tells the Army, and in the case of our exercise here, it's going to say, hey, for 17 to 21, there are going to be 2 of these units active in Korea and Fort Stewart, and 2 of these units in the National Guard in North Carolina and Arkansas. And the Army will also send back to the Joint Chiefs, because they gave us guys at the front, we sent them the POM Force memo back saying, hey, here's the results of our analysis. Here's what the Army is going to look like. Now that, you'll see a dotted line. Once we get the R-Struct, that's going to inform the beginning of the programming phase of PPBE. And that's going to tell the programmers what is required to buy in the organizations, how many units do we need to buy, material, personnel, and facilities. Okay, so that tells us the number of people we need to buy, so they can figure out how much this is going to cost for organizations, material, personnel, and facilities. So that informs at the beginning. That's what we are required to buy by the TAA. So after TAA, out comes the command plan informing the Army what's going to happen and what the Army's going to look like. So let's leave that alone for organizations right now, because as that's kind of in a pause right now until we get through the resourcing phase. So now let's look at material change. TRADOC reviews the initial capabilities document, and they submit it to the AROC, the Army Requirements and Oversight Council. We talked about them in class. And they look at it and for review and for approval or disapproval or for changes and things like that. If they say it's good to go, and if it's a joint requirement like the JLTV that we're doing right now, they'll send it up to the JROC for approval. If it's only an Army requirement, they'll approve it or disapprove it for a recommendation for changes, etc. But if it's approved, then it goes to the acquisition community. And here's another red star on our life cycle model. So this is looking at the acquisition, the buying of the equipment. So it goes through the whole DAS model we talked about, through all the milestones, and it starts at initial operating capability. Now, at the beginning of the DAS, once they decide they're going to buy this thing, that again is going to inform the beginning of the programming cycle every year, because there are hundreds of different programs in different phases. So that's going to tell them the required funds for research development, testing, and evaluation, and procurement. How many of these things do we want to buy? So for the purposes of our example, it's really going to inform them on this new piece of equipment, this flexible hose line that we're going to build. So they do the programming phase, and out comes the Programming Objective Memorandum and the Budget Estimation Submission, the BES. That's the one that goes up to Congress every year. So this has assumed all the risk, all the priorities, all the mitigations, etc. over this 20-month time frame. And out comes how much money is going to go toward each priority. Well, these were all priorities at the beginning. And they informed the programming phase, but because of all the other priorities that are going on in the Army, the POM is going to divide up the money that we're going to request equally among all, and with the associated risk. So that is going to determine what we can buy of this piece of equipment and what we can buy in organizations and manpower. We put in what we were required to based on the initial plans. Now we're going to say, here's what we actually can buy. So as an example, we may have decided we wanted to buy 10,000 JLTVs, and we put that into the program based on the number of organizations and where those MRAPs are going, JLTVs are going to be authorized in MTOs. But as we go through the program phase, the leadership may look and say, hey, we can only afford to buy 9,000. So go buy 9,000 acquisition system, and G3, figure out where you're going to take the cuts, because we're only going to buy 9,000 instead of what you originally said was 10,000 requirement. So once we have that programming input, the G357, use of PHMSA again doing all the heavy lifting and all the data crunching for them. They approved the MTO, which shows all the risk and where the holes are going to be for personnel and equipment. And again, you can see those on FMS Web. For the DAS system, equipment is then designed, money's received, it's programmed, and they start producing this piece of equipment. So then the budgeting phase starts. We send it up to Congress, they eventually approve it, and we start executing to start buying people, buying equipment, etc. So, all I've done here with this slide is cut a lot of the things off the front here. We've talked about the organizational change here, so we've copied that. We now have an approved MTO. We talked about the DAS and how we produce this thing. We decide how many we're going to buy, and we're producing them and fielding them to units. Now I'm going to introduce personnel here as one of the other .mil PFP domains. So as personnel is going on, doctrine and training are also being developed out there by TRADOC. So the program is going to determine what we're going to do. The budget and execution are still ongoing in parallel with these other actions. So personnel are now being assessed and reclassified for our fuel unit. There's another star about acquiring personnel. Personnel are now trained. Once they go through the accessions process and join the Army, we send them to the basic course and AIT and then the quartermaster school, and they're being trained in accordance with the doctrine that was written here. So that's our training phase of our Army life cycle. Now for the force integration piece that we talked about in F105 and how this all goes together. Everything is driven by the DARPL, the Dynamic Army Requirements Priorities Listing. Everything is circled by that. So when you get equipment, when units are activated, when personnel shows up, is all driven by the priorities. So we've decided on this. Everything's laid out by priority. The unit's going to activate on a certain E date. So that MTO then becomes effective. Equipment is going to be delivered in accordance with the Army equipping guidance we learned about in F105. And then G1 is going to do the manning guidance, and they're going to make report dates and assignments, putting the faces to the spaces for the MTO. And that's all going to happen at Camp Swampy. The whole point of force integration is to combine everything, synergy and timeline-wise, at the installation where we're going to activate it. So FORSCOM is going to activate this unit. There's our little symbol here. The equipment's going to show up. Personnel are going to show up. And now there's 3 more symbols. Okay. It's going to be deployed from here. It's going to be separated from here. And it's also going to be developed. We're going to make the people better. We're going to make them better operators. We're going to make them better leaders. We're going to develop the equipment, make it better equipment. So there's other points in the Army life cycle model there. Facilities will be complete. The unit will sign for all their equipment. They'll do individual and collective training. And once they're certified, they're going to go into the sustainable readiness model, and that's where they'll be deployed from. So now you have a pretty good view of the entire process, from the combatant commander looking at all the strategic documents, knowing what they need to have, sending it over to the Joint Staff identifying it, sending it down to the Army identifying, building that capability, and how it goes from force structure, doctrine, organization, training, material, personnel. Leader education will be in here as well, teaching new leaders how to do this. Facilities are being built on a separate line down here, or changed or modified. So that all the .mil PFP domains are done by the time Camp Swampy receives this unit to start training it to enter it into the sustainable readiness model to provide a trained and ready unit to the combatant commander in support of national security objectives. So hopefully you have a better understanding of the whole process by our little example here. It's quite complicated. Systems are not parallel. They do run, systems are not sequential. They are parallel. They run, they influence each other all over the place at different times. This is not a fast process. It's a very deliberate process, but it can be sped up, but there's obviously associated risk. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a better explanation. We'll go over this in class. And that should wrap up the training.